Hello, I am Ghanwa Hakim, and you are watching The Arabic Hour. On today's program, we bring you coverage of A New Day, organizing to change U.S. policy on Israel and Palestine, a conference that took place recently in Cambridge, Massachusetts, featuring Rami Khouri, Nadia Ben-Youssef, and M.J. Rosenberg.
The pro-Israel kids, the AIPAC kids, are on the defensive, which is why a movement like BDS, which is not that big a movement and hasn't had these great victories yet, drives them insane. Why are they so hysterical about BDS if BDS isn't accomplishing something? It's obviously accomplishing something.
The U.S. was one of the mediators, so the U.S. can mediate equitably and fairly based on the rule of law and multinationally. And that should be one of the main requirements for a campaign to move American involvement forward in mediating a Palestinian-Israeli peace.
In the last month and a half in Israel-Palestine has been devastating, has been absolutely devastating. Mass arrests, unbelievable violations of human rights, extrajudicial executions. I would view that as a challenge to us to make clear that the struggle for justice in Palestine is a civil rights issue. It is an issue of supremacy. It is an issue of equality. And when you frame it in those terms, it's impossible to ignore.
A New Day, organizing to change U.S. policy on Israel and Palestine, was the name of a recent conference that took place on November 14, 2015, at Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and was sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action Palestine-Israel Working Group, co-sponsored by Jewish Voice for Peace Boston, United for Justice with Peace, Arlington UJP, Greater Boston Code Pink, Friends of Sabeel North America New England Chapter, Dorchester People for Peace, Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice and the Environment, North Shore Coalition for Peace and Justice, Tree of Life Educational Fund, Jewish Women for Justice in Israel-Palestine, Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East Massachusetts Chapter. Guest speakers were Rami Khouri, a Palestinian-Jordanian and a U.S. citizen, attached to the Middle East Research Centers in Beirut and at Harvard and Tufts. He is editor-at-large of the Daily Star newspaper in Beirut. Nadia Ben-Youssef, the first U.S. representative of Adalah, the legal center for minority rights in Israel, is now working to promote a human rights-based approach in U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine. And M.J. Rosenberg, after 35 years in government and 4 years at AIPAC, has become a champion of Israeli-Palestinian peace and a vocal opponent of the pro-Israel lobby. And now to the conference.
But we will begin with half a minute of silence for the victims in Paris, in Beirut, and all the other victims of racism, colonialism, and chauvinism. So I think it honors all these victims best if we can change the way things work in this world, and that's sort of our aim. That's why this conference is called A New Day, but it's got a big question mark after it. So those of us who helped plan the conference hope that today we'll see glimmers of the dawn of this new day. We assume that all or most of you here know a lot about oppression and injustice in Palestine and Israel. So the background of our discussions today is mainly our complicity as U.S. citizens, and most of us as taxpayers, so that we unintentionally help to enable the oppression and injustice. Some of us feel an especially unwelcome degree of complicity as Jews. My family and I were among the lucky few to get out of Nazi Vienna in 1939. So now, when I hear Jews say, "never again," I'm skeptical, because often what they mean is, "never again must this be done to us," while I mean, "never again must this be done to anyone, no matter who the oppressors are." That should be the lesson that all Jews got from the Holocaust, but it's clear that many in Israel and here did not. So the emphasis today is less on horrors over there and more on our own elected officials, mainly Congress, but also in Massachusetts. And to start us off, Jeff Klein, who was the progenitor of this conference, will explain further why we're here, what we hope to do, and what obstacles and opportunities we face.
Welcome, everyone. We're gratified to see so many people here packing this room, and we know more people are on their way. To repeat what Eva said, this conference today is about planning and organizing to change U.S. policy on Palestine and Israel. We hope you'll find the presentations interesting and informative, but if that is all, then we will have failed in the purpose of this conference. Most of you are already pretty familiar with the details of what goes on in Israel and Palestine and beyond. You've visited Palestine, read, attended many meetings and lectures. You know a lot. But knowing or knowledge is not enough. We have to use that knowledge to make real changes right here in our own country. Everyone understands here, certainly, that behind the atrocities we follow in Israel, behind the occupation, the violence, the land grabs, and the settlements, is the power of the United States of America, our country. Our military aid and our made-in-USA weapons allow the Israelis to launch their wars both at home and abroad. Our diplomatic and political shield protects Israel from any accountability under international law. Israel depends on the U.S. to maintain its system of occupation and oppression in Palestine. Our job is to change that. Many of us are able to argue, are very knowledgeable, able to argue about what's happening in Palestine, what the right political strategy is, how we should proceed, whether there should be a one-state or a two-state solution, and all of that knowledge and those arguments are useful, but here we want to talk about the 50-state solution. The 50 states in our country, the United States of America. The truth is, there will be no freedom and no peaceful, just outcome in Palestine and Israel unless we are able to achieve change right here through our 50-state solution. The obstacles are daunting. We faced an experienced, entrenched, and very well-financed constellation of organizations that we call the Israel Lobby in the United States, led, of course, by AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They take their marching orders directly from Israel, and they project a unified political and legislative agenda. For decades, they've held sway in Congress almost without challenge. On our side, we have many dedicated activists. Our movement is varied and broad, but also fragmented and inconsistent in our messaging. Attempts to influence our elected representatives have been sporadic and mostly ineffective, reflecting in part our inexperience and our lack of ability to mobilize. We've not been doing a great job in challenging the Israel lobby in Congress. Our reality is that here in the United States we have to contend with two political parties. One of them is very pro-Israel. The other one is extremely pro-Israel. But there's an important difference. Republican leaders more or less reflect the opinion of the base of their party, especially in the evangelical Christian community and the South and the Midwest. On the other hand, the Democratic Party establishment increasingly does not represent the opinion of its base. Public opinion polls show a widening partisan divide, especially among key Democratic Party constituencies, liberals, progressives, African Americans, and youth. All of these are trending to be much less sympathetic to the Israeli narrative and more supportive of Palestinian rights. Our challenge is to make this changing opinion at the base of the Democratic Party operative among the elected representatives and ruling circles of that party. In a sense, our immediate task in furthering the 50-state solution is really the blue state solution, because our hopes for change are primarily in influencing and moving the leaders of the Democratic Party. We're probably not soon going to have a lot of influence in Mississippi or Kansas. We have another difficulty. In this room, most of us are progressive activists. We feel very attached and very strongly about the issue of Palestine, but there are other things that we care about too. So sometimes we support or vote for candidates who are not so good on our issue, but whom we agree with on many other issues that are also important. On the other side, though, the Israel lobby, and especially some of its billionaire political investors, see Israel as the single overriding issue, the make-or-break issue of supporting somebody. So there's a kind of asymmetry there. As progressives, we're sometimes torn to support someone who's not so good on our issue, but good on other issues. But for the Israel lobby, loyalty to their line and loyalty to Israel is the one single issue that pays for them. Now, our politicians understand this. Most of them are not stupid. They got elected to office. Most of them are not stupid anyway. They got elected to office understanding a certain political calculus. That if they go against the Israel lobby, the retribution is certain and definite. They know what to expect. There's been a track record, there's been experience. If they ignore what we have to say, they feel that it's risk-free. So that's the equation that we have to change. We also should learn from the past. And one of the things that many of us participated in was the movement against South African apartheid, which was a successful movement, we should all remember. With the whole world turning against South African apartheid, that government depended for its lifeline on the U.S., just like Israel. It lost the rest of the world, but as long as it had the U.S. government engaging with it and backing it, it felt able to continue. All of that changed when the U.S. Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986. The jig was up for apartheid sooner or later, and they came to the table to negotiate a soft landing rather than a hard overthrow. Now, people will say, well, we didn't face the same opposition then as we face now, and that's true. But there was opposition and support for the South African apartheid regime, more than we care to remember. The movement in this country grew up under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And the Republican Party and big business were united in their stance of constructive engagement with the apartheid regime rather than sanctions. It was our movement in the streets, in the congressional offices, and especially well-known figures who were willing to risk arrest at the South African embassy in Washington that eventually made that position untenable. And the Anti-Apartheid Act was passed in Congress over the veto of President Ronald Reagan, including substantial votes from Republicans as well as Democrats. So it took many years for Congress to act. The first anti-apartheid sanctions bill was introduced in Congress in 1972 by Ron Dellums, one of the founders of the Black Congressional Caucus. It took till 1986 to get it passed, with a large mass movement behind it. So we can learn some lessons from this, and as we look to our own campaign, our own 50-state campaign. We're starting here in Massachusetts, but this is a good place to begin. At the risk of sounding chauvinistic, I'm a transplant from Brooklyn to Massachusetts myself. At the risk of sounding chauvinistic about our state, I would remind you, especially you out-of-state visitors, that Massachusetts is the cradle of the American Revolution and was the key location for the building of the movement to abolish slavery in the United States. We were the first state, we were the first state to divest from South Africa legally. In the 1980s, two of our representatives in Congress, Ed Bolin and Joe Moakley, led the fight in Congress to stop supporting murderous dictators in Central America. Some of us remember that campaign too. We greeted Nelson Mandela in 1990 when he had just left prison in South Africa and was still listed on the U.S. State Department's terrorist watch list. Thousands of people turned out to greet him at the Hat Show. And finally, we were the first state to legalize same-sex marriages. I want to repeat what Eva said. If you look at the title of our conference, A New Day, you see that there's a large question mark behind the title. A new day? It's our job today to begin at least, to turn that question mark into an exclamation point. And that's the work we're doing here and starting now. Let's get to work.